All right, guys. So in this chapter, we're going to be examining perception, self, and communication. And a lot of this chapter gets at how we come to understand ourselves, and how our self influences how we see the world and how we interpret things and how we communicate with one another and how we share ideas and how we come to understand things. So we're really looking at the crucial role communication plays in the development of the self. And after this chapter is over, these are the main things we're going to go over. You should be able to identify the ways in which we select, organize, and interpret information from the environment to form perceptions. So, how do we actually see things and come to understand things and then process it in our mind? And then, how does this lead to particular perceptions that we develop? You should also be able to explain the nature of the self and its relationship to communication. So, what's that relationship to the self and the self concept and how that relates to communication? And then also, you'll be able to examine the ways in which communication technologies and new media influence perception and identity. So, again, we're looking a lot at identity, the self, communication, and thus how ultimately ourselves perceive communication and interact with one another. So, first off, we should have a definition of perception. Perception we can define as the process of being aware of and understanding the world. This helps us form and challenge and reinforce our ideas, values, and beliefs, which then influence how we choose to interact with others. So, perception, often we think of perception as okay, I'm processing, I'm interpreting something, or I'm perceiving something, or this is quote unquote how I'm seeing this interaction, or this is how I thought you meant this. Well, what happens is over time, we either form new ideas based on our perceptions, we challenge new ideas, challenge us, or our ideas are reinforced, and over time we develop these perceptions and with these ways of understanding the world, and these ultimately influence how we choose to interact with others, if we choose to interact with others, and it kind of our background, our perception, just really overall influences the way we go about communicating, interacting, and the choices that we make when designing messages and the choices that we make when decoding messages. So, both the creation of messages and the process of understanding and decoding messages being sent to us are highly based on our perception that we've developed and the way that we've come to understand the world. And this also leads to selective attention. And what this is essentially is the process of concentrating on one part of an environment while not paying attention to the others. So, with our perception, we tend to develop these gravitational types of pulls towards things. We recognize certain things in certain situations that we wouldn't, and other things that we wouldn't. I mean, if you think about the products that you buy or the things that you're interested in, or the hobbies that you're involved in. If you're watching ESPN, you're probably gonna, pay attention or listen a little bit more, if it's like a basketball segment that they're going over and you're a basketball fan, as opposed to, like horseback riding, for instance, or when you're driving down the highway and there's particular billboards with messages on them, we probably tend to remember and recall ones that somehow relate to us or we find interesting. And that's because our perception is kind of leading us to be drawn to and pay attention to these particular messages while ignoring others. It's focusing on one event, it often involves ignoring events that are less expected. So we almost develop these patterned ways of viewing and coming to understand our perceptions. And also we look at a particular type of environment, and we often think of how things should play out in that environment or how things should be, quote unquote, in that environment. So therefore we develop kind of this routine or pattern, or just way of kind of expecting things to be. If you have a moment, look up in YouTube, monkey business illusion. Some of you have probably seen this, others of you haven't. It's worth watching. It's really fun. It really shows you how in a particular situation, in a particular context, we expect to see things. So then when certain things happen that we don't expect to see, we often don't even realize they're happening. Even when we expect the unexpected, we may fail to notice many stimuli. So go Google, on YouTube or whatever, the monkey business illusion. Check that video out, and it does a really good job of demonstrating what selective attention is. There might be some kind of exam question related to the monkey business illusion, so please do go watch it. It only takes a few minutes, and it's pretty fun. But then we also, on the flip side, selective attention is where we're kind of watching things and looking for things. Selective exposure kind of flips it over, and this is when we expose ourselves only beliefs, values, and our ideas that are similar to our own. So we often won't even engage or try to attempt to understand certain things if they don't really align to us. So we don't really expose ourselves to a lot of different cultures. We often don't try to understand other people and their beliefs because they don't align with our belief systems, and therefore we just kind of avoid those things. This is related to selective exposure theory, and what this theory basically gets at is individuals prefer messages that support their own positions, and we select messages to support our emotional state. Basically, we like to expose ourselves and we like to support and believe in and buy into messages that already align with how we think and how we feel about particular things. And we also have selective perception, and this is when we filter what is seen and heard to make it suit our needs, our biases, our expectations. It's basically after we select and expose ourselves and attend to a message, we filter that message to make it suit our own needs or our views. Or how we think things should really be. So that's how you have two people listening to one objective message, and person A interprets it completely different and hears it in a completely different way than person B does. That's probably because they have different values or they feel differently about it. That's why when we hear politicians say a certain thing, person A might say, "Oh, well, they meant this by that," and person B would be like, "No, no way, they meant this by that." And this doesn't just happen in politics. I mean, this happens in a variety of interpersonal contexts. But it's this basic idea that our perception, we selectively organize and fit messages, and we choose to perceive things in ways that align and fit our needs or our biases or what we would expect to happen or understand in any given situation. We also have selective memory. This is the same thing. It allows us to use past experiences to affect current and future performances. We use the things from the past, our lessons that we've learned, the experiences that we've had in the past, and those inform how we are going to act next. They inform how we're going to process and perceive something. They inform how we're going to act upon that and develop a message when we want to interact. It's going to inform how we, basically perceive and interpret, and it's also going to inform ultimately how we choose to act when we're in a variety of situations. It's constantly evolving. It's selective because it involves both remembering and forgetting. All right, so one of the key things with memory and the way that we define it, the way we're operationalizing it, is it's not just about how much you can remember, but a lot of what we forget informs how we make decisions based on memory. It's creative. We create our memories out of bits and pieces of information we can recall and form ideas and expectations out of what should have happened. So our memories, most of the time, are not the full, objective, detailed version of exactly what happened, but more of kind of this puzzle that we've just kind of pieced together and we've kind of just made it work for us. And it's just become this frame of reference that we use. It's socials. It's social, meaning they're responsive to the ideas of others. So what we feel that we remember isn't just something that we remember ourselves, but others have influenced that memory to become a piece of memory, and they can be constructed or reconstructed on the basis of what another person communicates about an occurrence. So we might think of a situation or recall something differently if somebody else has a different version of it. And, that's if you've ever had something that you recall from when you were younger or whatever, and somebody tells a story a little bit differently, then maybe like, oh, maybe it did kind of happen that way. So it's constantly evolving. It's creative. We come up with bits and pieces and kind of put together this puzzle that works for us, and it's social. Memory is created through interacting with other people. And then we also organize all of these perceptions. So this all comes down to perception, and we're constantly organizing this. We organize information we select so it makes sense to us. We organize things in a way that doesn't make sense for everybody. It's not the standard or the status quo of how things should be, but we organize information in a way that works for us. We come up with schemas. Schemas are mental structures developed from past experiences that help us respond to some stimuli in the future. So we come up with certain schemas about what a job interview should look like, or what acting in the classroom should look like, or how dinner time at your girlfriend's parents' house when you're meeting them for the first time should look like. We come up with these schemas so we have an idea of how the interactions within those situations should play out and how you should behave. There's two types of schemas. There's prototypes and there's stereotypes. So prototypes help us to answer the question, what is it? When we encounter a message, a person, or a social situation. This is kind of what I was talking about before. You're about to go to dinner, you're going to meet your boyfriend's parents for the first time. This prototype allows you to, in your mind, kind of configure. This is what the dinner is going to look like. These are the possible questions that might get answered. This is what, this is how I should respond to those questions. This is how this is how the conversation should go. This is what I should wear. So on and so forth. There are these prototypes about certain people or a certain message or a certain social situation. Where stereotypes go a little bit farther, and these are generalizations made to an entire group of people or a situation on the basis of the observed traits of one or a few members of the group. So this is if we see one individual that's got a particular background, we obviously, a stereotype is where, all blank people do blank. All right, we're all familiar with what stereotypes are. Stereotypes are good, stereotypes are bad. Normally we think of stereotype, and the word itself has a negative connotation, but if you're walking down the street and you're being chased by somebody with a knife, and you see somebody up ahead wearing a police uniform, you're going to stereotype them as a cop, right? And you're going to use that stereotype in a positive way to, reach out for help to this person. Now, if this dude's wearing a cop outfit and he's not a cop, well, that's just a weird situation anyhow. But 9 times out of 10, it's probably a police officer. You've used your stereotype accurately to get some sort of help. We also know how stereotypes can be bad. We tend to generalize towards an entire race, towards an entire gender, towards an entire ethnicity, so on and so forth, based on the actions of a very few people. And then we make it easy for ourselves by creating these stereotypes. So I challenge you to think about your stereotypes. And every time you're in one of those situations where you're making a stereotype, and we do this all the time, really analyze that stereotype and ask yourself, is this really accurate? Is this really something that an entire group of people represent? Or should I kind of take a step back and be a little bit more critical of my perception when it comes to stereotypes? We also have interpersonal constructs. We use interpretations of people or social situations to judge, interpret, and understand. And cognitive complexity plays a big role in all of this. Cognitive complexity is basically how complicated can you see things? How many factors can you consider in any given situation? Instead of just saying, Steve's a jerk, that's why he's always acting like this. Can you try to consider all the other variables that may that may lead to him acting like this? How was he raised? How are his relationships? How's his job? How's his mom doing? How was his day? Maybe he's got a cat that's sick. Who knows what the situation might be? But how can you demonstrate multiple ways of thinking about others and in a variety of terms for describing others? So how complex can you see individuals in their life and how they're doing things? There's 4 characteristics, basically numerous. How many different factors, how many different ways can you think of a person or a situation? How abstract and how far out can you take your thinking? How well can you organize all of those numerous abstract ideas? And then are you capable of handling contradictions to your own personal beliefs and opinions? If you can do those 4 things, you're a pretty cognitively complex individual, and therefore you probably have a lot of depth and a lot of different ways of thinking about and understanding situations, and it makes you a competent communicator. We also have scripts. These are organized sequences of actions that define a well-known situation. So again, this is kind of similar to the dinner thing, or dating is a good example of this. We have scripts about kind of what the whole courting process is like. First you ask them out, and then you go on a date, and then you try this, and then by the 3rd date you're allowed to do X, Y, and Z, whatever. It's basically a sequence of action that define well-known situations that we can all agree upon, and dating's one of them. These are constantly revised and rewritten to organize perceptions in a way that account for new information. Tinder, apps like that have kind of reorganized the scripts when it comes to dating. It's made things a little bit different now, where it was like you actually have to go approach somebody. Now if you both swipe right, boom, step 1 of the dating script completed. Interpretation. This is the process of giving meaning to information. So perceiving is just kind of on the subconscious side of things, where we're organizing back there, or developing the subconscious ways of thinking that we're not 100% aware of. But interpretation is where we give meaning to information. So we consider the context in which a conversation or a relationship or a situation is taking place. There's unlimited possibilities of interpretations for different stimuli. Whatever stimulates us, whatever captures our attention, whatever gets us to listen, whatever gets us to see. There's an endless amount of ways that we can interpret things and then we construct meaning around it. And the three stages of perception happen simultaneously while happening continuously. So we're constantly interpreting, we're constantly relearning information, and we're continuously developing new interpretations. We have all sorts of things that influence our perception. Cultural influences are a huge one. We understand and interpret the world from unique features of various social groups, the background that we have, the way we were raised, the religious things that we were taught, what we learned in school, what we learned about dating, what we learned about different sexes, what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what is brought and what is valued and what is taught within the cultures in which we grow up in influence us a lot in terms of how we perceive things. What's your socioeconomic background? So on and so forth. All these different things that are part of culture have a huge influence on how we perceive the world. And standpoint theory captures this, and it basically gets at the idea that our points of view arise from the social groups we belong to and influence how we socially construct the world. So an individual from a family of low income, maybe they're a marginalized group, they grew up in a rural area, they're going to have a much, much different perception of the world. They're going to see things differently. They're going to interact with people differently. They're going to perceive the words of others differently than somebody that, grew up in a very wealthy household, that, went on, that owns a lot of things or whatever, and they're from, they're from a dominant type of group within a given culture. So just understand that your cultural background has a huge influence on how we perceive things and ultimately how we choose to interact and act in the world. Media is another huge influence on our perception. We learn to perceive and evaluate ourselves in the world in particular ways. The media tells us what's cool, what's sexy, what's awesome, what you should be like. In a lot of ways. It tells us what good is. It tells us what bad is. It tells us what right is. It tells us what wrong is. And we listen to this often, and this influences how we perceive things and evaluate, not just ourselves. We can think of a lot of the different types of, this is super hard on women. It's a challenge for men too. But there's all these images of women in the media that literally are not even real. It's photoshopped, and altered. Women in commercials. I mean, it's literally an impossible thing to reach. Yet the media is portraying this is what beauty is. This is what sexy is, and all these commercials, sex sells. Women see this. Young girls see this, and this influences their self-esteem. It influences how they view themselves, and it influences how they perceive themselves. Men get it too. We see all the commercials of chiseled up dudes at the gym or at the beach drinking a Corona in a Corona commercial. Everybody's hot. Everybody wants to be around those guys. I mean, we see this stuff. The media has I'm just talking about gendered stuff right now. The list goes on and on for how media influences our perception, but often sex and gender is a huge one. Our fields of experience. This is our collections of attitudes, perception, and personal backgrounds. It's everything that we've ever done. It's the things that make us unique. It's the experiences we've had that other people haven't. These all influence our perceptions. Interpretations of the present moment are affected by our past experiences, basically. So every little thing that we've done leading up to this moment, which I'm in this interaction with you right now, that's going to have an influence on my perception. And also language. Words carry meanings that structure what we are able to think, imagine, and express. Words give us the ability to perceive and interpret things in certain ways and prevent us from perceiving and interpreting things other ways. Language it's symbols. Language creates the ways in which we express meaning and create meaning. So it's also a huge influence on our perception. And all this boils down to our self-concept. And this is the general perception we have of who we are. We can break it down into three big categories. It's our possible selves. This is a vision of what we might become, what we would like to become, and what we are afraid of becoming. So this is when you're envisioning your future, what your career looks like, what your family life looks like, what the house you want to buy looks like, what what your career looks like, what your accomplishments look like. This is kind of your envision of who you are and who you want to be. Um, there's also the self image. This is our mental picture of self. This is the mental view that we feel we give off to the world. This is what other people see of us. This is how other people interpret us. This is how other people come to understand us. And then there's self esteem. This is basically where you assess your self worth. How important am I to the world? How important am I to other people? How important am I to my family? So on and so forth. And the self is developed in a lot of really interesting and fascinating ways. Starting with symbolic interactionism. This is an early theory from like the 1940s ish. And what it gets at is communication is the primary means by which we internalize and use social values to guide how we see ourselves, how we see others, and how we interact. We develop our self concepts through communicating with other people. If we didn't have the ability to have a conversation with somebody, if you didn't have, if your parents didn't say certain things about you growing up, if teachers didn't say certain things about you growing up, if important people, mentors, family members didn't say certain things about you growing up and share that information, or if you weren't able to express that information and say, this is who I am, this is what I'm all about, the self doesn't exist. There has to be interaction, and you have to relate with other people. Otherwise, the self is never really developed. So what symbolic interaction gets at is communication is the means by which our self is developed. We have no idea who we are, who our identity is, if we don't have the ability to interact with other people. And one of the biggest reasons for that is the looking glass self. This gets at the idea that we have the ability to view ourselves as others do. So, what is reflected back to us? What do others say about us? What hints are others giving to us about who we are? Do people generally say I'm a nice person, or do people say I'm an asshole all the time? Do people say I'm attractive, or do they say I'm ugly? Do they think I'm tall, or do they think I'm short? Some of these things you can kind of assess yourself, but by having others reflect that back to us through the looking glass self, it's literally like a mirror. This is how we learn. It's how we imagine how we must appear to others. It's how we judge that appearance, and we develop a sense of self by judging others through that. So this is who I am. All right, how are you like that? How similar are we in that? And then generalized others gets at this is like the viewpoint that we develop of an entire society. How is everybody different from me? What makes me unique compared to all these other people? So it's a combination of taking feedback that you receive from them while at the same time separating yourself from them and making yourself unique. And then we have a relational self. This is difficult, sometimes impossible to understand yourself by viewing yourself through the eyes of society as a whole. So we have a saturated self and a relational self. The saturated self is an identity that is infused with numerous and sometimes incompatible views of others. So we understand who we are based on the view of others. That kind of separate us. But then there's also the relational self, and this is the process of constantly becoming who you are as a result of togetherness with others. So there's the saturated self that's kind of like we have these views of other people that we either identify with or we don't. And then the relational self is we are who we are based on the relationships that we have with other people. And then there's the mediated self. This is a virtual type of thing. This is some newer stuff with technological advances. This is our presence in virtual environments and interactions with technology that impact how we see ourselves, or how we interact on Facebook, what kind of pictures we post on Instagram, what do we retweet on Twitter, what is our Snap story all about, and how many people are viewing it. All these things influence how we understand our mediated self. And the tethered self is our identity is created through our co-presence in the real world and our mediated self. So it's this really unique concept that gets at we kind of have this virtual like social media type of reality, but we also have the real life face-to-face version of yourself. And if you combine those two things, that's what's considered the tethered self. That is the end of this lecture. Don't want to say a whole lot else.